In an MMORPG like Final Fantasy XIV, where we have many very different jobs to play, despite what the memes would tell you, achieving a state where everything is perfectly balanced is pretty much impossible. Although, in the current state of the game, perfect balance, the monk action, is relatively possible. Now, jokes aside, there are several reasons why getting the game perfectly balanced is impossible. And before I get too deep into this, I do recognize that a lot of players, when asking for better balance, are not asking for perfect balance, just better balance. But even that can sometimes be difficult to attain. With that said, let's talk about why perfect balance is impossible. 1. The closer the balance, the more nitpicky we become. For at least a significant portion of the player base, it isn't really about whether the jobs are viable and within a reasonable margin of each other, but rather about A is better than B. The way I've described it previously is that some amount of players don't view things like the FFlog statistics like this, but rather like this. For this kind of player, it doesn't actually matter how small or big the difference is unless it is so humongous that the difference itself overshadows the ranking on the left. The interesting thing is that over the years, I've seen people complain that a job was broken because it was a couple % ahead of the next one. But I have equally seen people complain because one job is a fraction stronger than another, even though the actual power difference between them hardly mattered. A hypothetical example could be, Dragoon can't offer more damage than Viper because Dragoon has more defense and life surge, and Viper doesn't have that. Even if the overall damage contribution difference is relatively minimal. To clarify, this comparison didn't actually happen, it was just a hypothetical. The reason why this kind of extreme comparison can happen is at least partly to blame on how a lot of gamers in general get overly focused on optimization. Why bring a Viper if Dragoon is very slightly better? Might as well pick the best option, right? This is even more likely to happen in less personal and subjective scenarios, such as Party Finder. If you are in a static and you play with Vincent every week, you probably will be much more likely to simply figure things out with them playing Viper, over demanding they either switch to Dragoon or get replaced with one. However, in Party Finder, you might not actually care that Billy Blackmage wants to play Blackmage if Pictomancer's better. You have zero interest in Billy as a person. It's their problem they chose to play the inferior job in that specific scenario. It makes logical sense to think like that. If you have the patience to wait for the optimal person, then you can do that, and you don't have to settle. If you can wait for the guy with 5+ years of experience with C++, then you have the flexibility to choose to decline the guy with only 2 years of experience. Yes, I just compared Party Finder to job interviews. So get back to the initial statement. In this kind of scenario, if we assume all jobs are viable and can beat all content, that doesn't really matter if there is a clearly best option. Especially if that best option is clearly better than the rest. It makes perfect sense for players to prefer that option. Even if the game is balanced such that it doesn't matter that the weakest option is, say, 10% weaker than the best, it also means that choosing the better option makes things like 10% easier, right? That's not exactly how that works, but I'm sure you get what I mean. For some players, this logic still applies even if the difference is only 1%. In a tough enough fight, you take any advantage you can get. Obviously, you want to win. 2. When talking about perfect balance, not the action, we tend to talk about damage output exclusively, and things like utility only feature secondarily. Some of you probably already noted that in the previous reason, I pretty much only briefly brought up utility at all as like extra salt on top of Dragoon already winning in the hypothetical. That is because the biggest issue in balance, especially in a game where the most impactful property of your performance is how much damage you do, of course becomes how high you rank, precisely on damage output. All other factors only really matter after that. In fact, if we, for a moment, imagined a purely hypothetical scenario where somehow in an average boss fight, all tanks contribute exactly the same damage, all healers contribute exactly the same damage, and all DPS contribute the exact same damage. In all three cases, this somehow includes the damage gained from raid buffs. This would effectively remove DPS itself as a factor when putting together your team. I'm sure some of you are already thinking, that's impossible though. And that's why this is imaginary. However, if we take this imaginary scenario forward, if you cannot rank jobs based on their damage performance, where do you go next? Well, if Viper and Reaper brings the exact same total DPS over the course of a fight, exactly the same, then why are you bringing a Viper? Reaper has Arcane Crest. Why are you bringing a Black Mage or a Pictomancer? Both Summoner and Red Mage have reses. It's just slightly easier that way. Sure, Pictomancer has a raid-wide barrier, and that could make a difference, but I assume you get my point. If we somehow removed damage output as an important measurement, then we would move on to measuring on utility. Case in point, why are you bringing a Viper over a Machinist? Disregarding the defensive cooldowns, Machinists are ranged. 3. Okay then, what if all jobs then also have the same utility? Or more precisely, each category has the same amount of utility. If Warrior has Holmgang on a 4-minute cooldown, then all tanks must have Holmgang or similar on a 4-minute cooldown. If Pictomancer gets to have a raid-wide barrier, well, then every DPS must have a raid-wide barrier. Either all DPS jobs have a res or none of them do. So now, in your average boss fight, all tanks are equal, all healers are perfectly equal, and all DPS are somehow perfectly equal. Let's not think too hard on the part where all DPS having the same utility could realistically mean that all of them are fully mobile and ranged, because otherwise the ranged physicals aren't either. But at this point, the jobs are just magically equal in power, but their rotations are still distinctly different, which means that their damage profiles are different. What does that mean? Well, in an average fight, you know, full uptime, only one target, constant fighting, they're all equal. But if there's 2 targets at any point, jobs with more incidental AoE in their rotation will pull ahead. If there's downtime, jobs with better downtime adaptation will pull ahead. Or if, for instance, a job has a raid quote-unquote buff that actually is a debuff applied to the target that increases damage done by everyone, the job pulls ahead if there are more players than just your party to benefit from it. For example, if a fight has 2 targets at any point, the fact the majority of the Paladin Burst and Gunbreaker Burst has colossal AoE components gives them an inherent slight advantage over Warrior and Dark Knight, who, while they do have that too, they have less of it. Similarly, as many of us have seen, a fight with a lot of frequent downtime gives Pictomancer a huge advantage. And even more recently, an Alliance raid gives Ninja especially a huge advantage. Also Scholar. But the weird thing about all these examples is that, at least in some part, taking away these advantages may make these jobs feel less unique. That doesn't mean that those advantages cannot be taken away, of course, but it does have the possibility of making things feel even more samey. One way this could be fixed is by rebalancing these jobs to not have that advantage in some way or another. For instance, Warrior and Dark Knight could just be granted a greater amount of AoE components to their burst to even things out between the tanks. Pictomancer's muses could be reduced to be a smaller gain for them, but that could of course also, if overdone, lead to a situation where Pictomancer's Observer DPS loss if they paint motifs outside of downtime, which would be absolutely hilarious for some, but would probably also kinda suck to play. Ninja and Scholar could be reined in a bit simply by making it so their debuffs either only apply for their party, or by reworking them to be a buff for the party in some way or another. Either way you swing it, to expand on the damage profile's point of view, the only way to make sure that no job suddenly steps out of line due to some weird inherent advantage is to make sure all jobs have approximately the same damage profiles. Let's assume they somehow do, while still somehow feeling distinctly different to play. I'm a mathematician, assuming impossibilities are just a thing we do sometimes. Let's calculate falling acceleration with gravity, but assume there is no air. Anyway, by making this assumption that all jobs have identical damage profiles, we now know for certain that all jobs in each role are perfectly equal in damage performance and perfectly equal in utility. You have no reason to pick Pictomancer over Red Mage, or Red Mage over Pictomancer, or Samurai over Machinist, or Dancer over Viper. They're all perfectly equally good options. Or are they? One thing that is often overlooked when comparing jobs is that even if one job is stronger than another, that isn't just a universal thing. At least not all the time. Even if, say, Paladin has a slight advantage over Warrior in certain fights, that is completely irrelevant if the Paladin player is bad at Paladin and the Warrior player is good at Warrior. If all the jobs in a category are equal in potential damage and utility, but they play differently, then what remains to compare is... well, why would you bring a Black Mage, an admittedly harder to play optimally job, over a Summoner? They bring exactly the same DPS and exactly the same utility, somehow. But Summoner is known to be the honorary ranged physical, right? Just a quick reminder, for all the DPS jobs to have equal utility, Black Mage and Summoner has to have equal mobility, so when I say Black Mage is admittedly harder, it is with the assumption that Black Mage's optimal rotation is more complicated than Summoner's. The point still stands, Summoner is generally considered easier to play than Black Mage, so why bring a Black Mage? Your average Summoner player would be better at Summoner than your average Black Mage would be at Black Mage. That's right. Reason 4. If damage output potential is the same and utility is the same, then the metric that matters is which job is easier to play. Because that directly means that the average performance will be higher. So how do we make it so that the difficulty of jobs is not the way players optimize picking jobs? What if all jobs are equally easy, or conversely, hard, to play? What is the easiest way to accomplish this? Incidentally, what is the easiest way to accomplish making sure all jobs have the exact same damage profiles, realistically, and without using impossible magic assumptions? Well, both of these problems can be solved by making all jobs the same. In other words, to reach perfect balance, we lose all uniqueness between jobs. Now, with all that said, that doesn't mean we can't find a decent balance. I just want to underline that expecting perfection is too much. Even if all jobs were to be equally strong in damage output between their roles, somehow, then there would be other factors to compare on. And while this doesn't apply to everyone, in fact, it probably applies to a relatively small amount of players, even if the damage difference between, say, all melee DPS jobs was about 1% apart, you would still find players preferring to bring whichever is at the top in content where it could have even the slightest impact on clear rate. For the average player, even the average, more hardcore player, this is not so big of a deal, unless the job has a significant impact on the clear rate. However, what we have observed in the recent months is that any fight that deviates even remotely from one enemy with full uptime and exactly 8 players seems to grant some of the jobs with something even remotely unusual a huge advantage. How do you fix that? Well, for example, you could adjust the tanks so that they have about the same incidental AoE components on their burst, but would that be enough? That actually also applies to Pictomans and the other mages, come to think of it. You could make it so that no job has a rate buff of some sort that applies to everyone beyond your party. Would that be enough? You could make it so that Pictomancer's motifs were much weaker and move that lost damage over to the filler rotation portion. How much could you move without making the motifs objectively worse than the filler rotation? And how much would it take for Pictomancer to still be fine and not go completely off the rails once they get a slight advantage in a fight? Other options, of course, also include revisiting utility and maybe taking some away and giving some elsewhere so the jobs that are further behind on damage have more they can bring to the table. But how much would be enough? As we know, utility only really matters when it makes a difference, so Red Mage's res is praised as absolutely irreplaceable, right up until the moment where it isn't helping anymore, just as an example. And well, if you don't need the power of a ranged physical job's 15% damage reduction, and you don't mind not having the 1% party bonus from bringing them, then you could just not have one. So how would we get good enough balance where all jobs are equally good and viable and you don't have a preference either way? That is probably an impossible target to reach, but it would be nice if things were more closely balanced. A particular note about jobs being distant in damage output, for example, is that if the game is balanced such that any balanced combination of jobs is capable of beating a duty, then it means the damage output of the weakest possible combination of jobs has to be enough. By comparison, that same duty will be incredibly easy if you bring the best combination of jobs. In other words, unfortunately, for challenges in Final Fantasy XIV to be balanced, while all jobs are viable in them, we need the damage output of jobs in general to be more closely balanced. Otherwise, we have scenarios where the best composition skips several mechanics, while the worst composition has to play near perfect just to have a chance of winning at all, which is probably not a very balanced experience either. There is, of course, also the option of making fights where something other than DPS checks is what decides the fight, but I'm actually not sure how you would go about that in the kind of combat Final Fantasy XIV is known for. One, perhaps, sidetracking consideration in the subject of balance is that in some games, the way options can be completely unbalanced without it causing problems is by having many different kinds of difficult content. For example, we have observed recently that content with a lot of downtime benefits jobs that adapt well to that really well. We have observed jobs that have buffs that affect all players in the area instead of just their party scale exceptionally well with more players, obviously. We also know from more unusual content like deep dungeons that jobs with more utility options often have an easier time, like tanks and ranged physical jobs having certain advantages in content with more interruptible things that matter and stunnable things that matter. The problem there, of course, is that there being challenges that benefit more unusual job advantages. That doesn't really matter if it falls outside of the scope of these kinds of optimizations, I suppose? My point is, if we had more fights per raid tier, that's a huge wish by the way, then there would be much more space to have a lot of bosses with various differences, enabling different jobs to have their day in the sunshine. However, one thing is having more bosses, another is actually making so many boss fights that every uniqueness of each job can shine is incredibly hard, so it is not really a realistic wish. But it is an interesting thought, I would say. It also comes with the extra caveat that cases where a specific job is really good at one specific boss in a tier, it sometimes just motivates players to switch to that job for just that one fight. So it doesn't really accomplish much anyway. So, I hope you found this discussion on perfect balance, not the monk ability, interesting. And I would love to hear your thoughts on the subject in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, before 6.1 of Endwalker, Ninja's damage buff for the raid, which is now situated on Mug and Dokomori, was situated on Trick Attack, which has, and had, only a 1 minute cooldown. This meant ninjas offered the entire raid effectively a raid buff every minute. As Ninja was the only job with such a unique property at the start of Endwalker, this caused certain jobs to have an extra advantage when paired with Ninja, and this, at least partly, may have contributed to Ninja's damage buff being moved to Mug and Dokomori, making it a 2 minute cooldown instead. The damage buff on Trick Attack and Kunai's Bane that remains is only for the ninja personally.